Imagine this. In just 10 years, the world's most powerful empire lost half the world. In 1763, Britain had just defeated all its rivals and ruled over a true empire on which the sun never sets. But by 1776, 13 North American colonies had brazenly declared independence, igniting a revolution that would completely reshape the world order. This wasn't an overnight collapse, but the result of a series of seemingly minor political missteps that accumulated over time. Each decision seemed reasonable. Each policy had its logic, but when combined, they created one of the greatest political disasters in history. Even more shocking is that the seeds of this revolution weren't planted by professional revolutionaries, but by lawyers, merchants, and plantation owners, the very people who should have been the empire's most loyal supporters. How did they transform from faithful British subjects into armed rebels? The answer reveals how power, arrogance, and misjudgment can destroy an empire. In 1763, Britain had just concluded the 7 Years' War and appeared more powerful than ever before. They had defeated France and Spain, gaining 3 million square miles of new territory, equivalent to the size of all Europe. Britain proudly proclaimed it ruled an empire on which the sun never sets. But the cost of victory was devastating. The war had inflated Britain's national debt to dangerous levels, with interest payments alone consuming more than half the government's annual spending. Worse still, these newly acquired American territories needed defending, as French and Spanish allies, Native American tribes, were waiting for any chance to seek revenge. In 1763, Ottawa Chief Pontiac led a tribal coalition in revolt, with every British fort west of the Appalachian Mountains coming under fierce attack. The bloody frontier warfare reminded the London government that maintaining this vast empire would consume enormous resources. Ironically, Britain's greatest threat wasn't from external enemies, but from the very colonies they were desperately trying to protect. For 157 years, Britain's North American colonies had been developing along their own paths. By 1763, the 13 colonies had more than 2 million inhabitants, each with distinctly different characters and ambitions. Massachusetts Puritans, Maryland Catholics, Pennsylvania Quakers. They had come to the New World seeking religious freedom, only to find themselves ruled by the same distant government. Even more complex, these colonies had vastly different economic structures. The North relied on trade and manufacturing, while the South was built on slave plantations. In Virginia, 40% of the population were African slaves. In South Carolina, this proportion reached 60%. Behind these numbers lay a brutal reality. Those who shouted for liberty were accumulating wealth through slave labor. But these differences became insignificant when facing a common enemy. 150 years of salutary neglect had accustomed the colonies to self-governance, and now Britain suddenly wanted to change the rules of the game. The influx of new immigrants was also changing colonial culture. Irish, Scottish, and German settlers brought new ideas and less attachment to the mother country. Visitors noted that Americans were becoming less deferential, more confident, and losing respect for traditional authority. But London politicians were completely unaware of the depth of this change. They were about to make their first fatal mistake. In 1764, Chancellor of the Exchequer George Grenville faced what seemed like a simple math problem: how to make the colonies pay for their own defense. In his view, this was completely reasonable. The average Briton paid 26 shillings in taxes annually, while a New Englander paid only 1 shilling. Grenville's solution seemed moderate and wise. The Sugar Act actually lowered taxes on foreign sugar and molasses, but required stricter collection. The Stamp Act taxed commercial and legal documents, from newspapers to playing cards, from attorneys' licenses to land grants. Britons had been paying these taxes for 70 years. Why would the colonies object? The answer shocked the entire British government. The colonies didn't just oppose the measures, they were furious. The Stamp Act particularly enraged merchants, lawyers, and business owners, the most influential and articulate members of colonial society. They condemned the measures in newspapers and a flood of pamphlets. This tax will deprive us of all our invaluable rights and privileges. It will suddenly drain us of our cash, cause complete stagnation of trade, discourage every kind of industry, and plunge us into the most abject slavery. But the British government completely misread the nature of this protest. This wasn't just about money. Colonial opposition focused on an explosive principle, the right of consent. Americans protested that they had no representation in the British Parliament and therefore could not accept taxation without representation. This slogan touched the core contradiction of the British political system. Grenville argued that the colonies had virtual representation in Parliament, meaning all British MPs represented their interests in a general way. After all, most Britons didn't have voting rights either. But this argument faced fierce attacks, even within Parliament itself. Former Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder angrily retorted, "There is an idea in some that the colonies are virtually represented in the House. I would fain know by whom an American is represented here. Is he represented by any knight of the Shire in any county in this kingdom? Or will you tell him that he is represented by any representative of a borough which, perhaps, its own representatives never saw? This is what is called the rotten part of the Constitution. It cannot continue a century." Even more shocking was his next statement. "This kingdom has no right to lay a tax upon the colonies." When Britain's most respected statesmen publicly questioned the legitimacy of government policy, colonial resistors found the moral authority they needed. But a bigger storm was brewing. In 1765, colonial assemblies convened to protest the new acts. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry emerged as one of the most radical voices of colonial resistance. His proposed resolutions were adopted by the House. Resolved that the first adventurers and settlers of His Majesty's colony and dominion of Virginia brought with them all the liberties, privileges, and immunities that have at any time been held, enjoyed, and possessed by the people of Great Britain. But even within the Virginia Assembly, divisions ran deep. Conservative members believed Henry went too far, with loyalty to Britain and the British Crown running deep. They successfully removed his most radical resolution that only Virginia's assembly had the right to tax the colony. Among the regular observers at these debates was a brilliant 22-year-old law clerk named Thomas Jefferson. He was witnessing a turning point in history. Street protests became increasingly violent. Tax collectors were beaten by mobs, driven out of towns, or forced to resign. Tax documents were destroyed. Effigies of royal governors were burned or hanged from liberty trees. Meanwhile, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York, drafting a petition to King George III in Parliament. While assuring the Crown and Parliament of their unwavering loyalty, the delegates declared that as Englishmen, they had the right not to be taxed without their consent. Colonial merchants began organizing boycotts of British goods. The uproar, potential trade damage, and the clear unenforceability of these taxes finally forced the British government to back down. Faced with such strong opposition, potential damage to trade, and the obvious impossibility of enforcing these taxes, the British government finally compromised. In 1766, new Prime Minister Lord Rockingham repealed the Sugar Act and Stamp Act. The colonies celebrated victory, and the boycott was lifted. The second crisis seemed to have passed. But the British Parliament didn't back down on its right to tax America. On the same day it repealed the taxes, it issued the Declaratory Act. Parliament hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. These words seem calculated to outrage America's colonial assemblies. The phrase, "in all cases whatsoever," was particularly disturbing. It implied Parliament claimed absolute power over the colonies. Many were convinced that while this storm had passed, another would surely follow. They were right. The only lesson the British government learned was to be more clever next time. In 1767, Parliament passed a new series of measures named after Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend. The Townshend Acts attempted to circumvent colonial opposition by imposing external taxes on imported goods rather than internal taxes like the stamp tax. In Townshend's view, this was a clever distinction. The colonies had previously accepted trade regulations, so why not accept taxes disguised as trade regulations? In the 13 colonies, these acts were met with howls of protest. Royal administrators were chased out of towns. Some tax officials were tarred and feathered, a brutal punishment where victims were covered in scalding tar, covered with feathers, and paraded through the streets. A new term emerged for these rabble-rousers: patriots. Colonists who sought to avoid confrontation with Parliament became known as loyalists. Many communities and even families would soon be divided between these two camps. For now, though, most remained somewhere in the middle, hoping to find a peaceful solution. But the radicals were organizing. Among the patriots in New England was a secret organization calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. Led by Samuel Adams, they included merchant and smuggler John Hancock, physician Joseph Warren, and silversmith Paul Revere. These weren't radical revolutionaries, but respected community leaders. Hancock was one of Boston's wealthiest merchants. Adams came from a prominent political family, and Revere was a skilled craftsman. But the Townshend Acts pushed them toward the edge of rebellion. The Sons of Liberty began coordinating boycott activities across the colonies. They organized protests, distributed propaganda materials, and intimidated tax officials. More importantly, they began unifying scattered colonial opposition into a coherent movement. But the real test was coming. The British government decided to station troops in Boston to ensure tax collection and maintain order. This decision would light a fuse whose consequences would shock the entire empire. The crisis reached its peak in Massachusetts. Boston had been a hotbed of patriot activity since the Stamp Act, and tensions escalated sharply when British soldiers were quartered there in 1768. The mere presence of soldiers was a provocation. Bostonians saw them as an occupying army, while the soldiers found themselves in a hostile environment, viewed by locals as tools of tyranny. On March 5, 1770, a cold winter night, an altercation between soldiers and locals escalated into a tense standoff. A British sentry got into an argument with a group of Bostonians, and soon hundreds of angry citizens gathered in front of the custom house. Faced with an angry crowd of hundreds taunting them, pelted with snowballs, stones, and chunks of ice, 8 British soldiers lost their nerve. Without orders, they fired into the crowd. 5 locals died and 6 were wounded. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a mixed-race sailor who became the first martyr of the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, as it became known, became powerful propaganda for the patriot cause. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty quickly seized the opportunity, portraying the incident as a symbol of British tyranny. Paul Revere created a famous engraving depicting British soldiers firing on unarmed civilians. This image severely distorted the facts. It showed soldiers firing in an organized manner under officers' orders, when in reality, it was accidental gunfire in the midst of chaos. But facts didn't matter. Revere's engraving spread throughout the colonies, stirring anti-British sentiment. Blood had been spilled. Emotions were running high. Bostonian Samuel Savage wrote in his diary, "Let March 5th never be forgot." Many anticipated a downward spiral into violence and disorder. But what happened next surprised everyone. Despite the bloodshed in Boston, many on both sides sought to de-escalate the crisis. Massachusetts British Governor Thomas Hutchinson withdrew troops from Boston and put the soldiers involved in the shooting on trial. Even more shocking, the lawyer defending these British soldiers was John Adams, a noted patriot and cousin of Samuel Adams. John Adams believed in the rule of law over political passion. In court, he successfully argued that the soldiers acted in self-defense, facing the threat of a mob. All but 2 soldiers were acquitted of murder charges, with those 2 convicted only of manslaughter. This decision shocked many Bostonians, but it also demonstrated the independence and fairness of the colonial legal system. Adams later wrote, "I am proud of this. It was one of the best services of my life." In Britain, there was a new Prime Minister, Lord North. As a close friend of King George III and staunch advocate of parliamentary authority, he would serve in this role for the next 12 years. The economic damage from colonial boycotts persuaded him to repeal Townshend's new taxes. All except one, the tea tax. North insisted on keeping this tax as a symbol of Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Relative calm returned to the colonies. The boycott was lifted. The second crisis seemed to have passed. Many hoped the worst was over, and that Britain and the colonies could find a way to coexist peacefully. But in New England, hostility toward the British government persisted. The merchants here had their own agenda, and British trade policies directly conflicted with their interests. More dangerously, a small group of radicals continued working underground, waiting for the next opportunity to challenge British authority. New England merchants relied on maritime trade for their livelihood and had long resented British navigation acts, which restricted their trade with other nations and forced them to conduct certain business only through Britain. Many patriots, like John Hancock, made extra money by smuggling goods into the colonies, bypassing British import duties. Smuggling wasn't just about profit, it was also a form of resistance to British trade monopolies. British authorities recognized this problem and began taking stricter enforcement measures. Royal Navy warships were dispatched to the American coast to inspect and seize suspected smuggling vessels. Hancock's ships were seized multiple times, enraging him and other merchants. Even more infuriating to New England merchants, the British began trying suspected smugglers in special Vice Admiralty courts rather than more sympathetic local courts. These courts were presided over by British-appointed judges, had no juries, and almost always ruled in favor of the Crown. The Sons of Liberty decided to fight back. In June 1772, an opportunity arose. HMS Gaspee, a British Royal Navy schooner that had been actively pursuing smugglers, ran aground off the Rhode Island coast. Local merchants despised this ship. When night fell, a group of masked colonists rowed out to the stranded warship. They overpowered the crew, wounded the captain, then set the ship ablaze. This was a direct attack on British authority, not protest or boycott, but armed assault on a British warship. The British government was shocked and offered rewards for information about the perpetrators, but no colonist was willing to provide information. The Gaspee incident showed a new level of colonial resistance. Patriots were no longer just protesting unjust laws. They were actively attacking symbols of British power. But the real showdown was still to come. Meanwhile, in Britain, the empire's largest corporation was on the verge of bankruptcy. The East India Company monopolized British trade with India, China, and the East Indies, but credit crises and mismanagement now threatened its survival. This company was crucial to the British Empire. It wasn't just a commercial enterprise, but a quasi-governmental agency ruling vast territories in India. If it went bankrupt, the entire empire's economic and political stability would be threatened. In 1773, to save the East India Company, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This law granted the company the right to sell tea directly to the American colonies, bypassing middlemen. The company also received tariff exemptions that would make its tea cheaper than local importers, including smugglers' tea. From the British government's perspective, this was a brilliant solution. It saved an important company, provided cheaper tea to colonists, and still collected the symbolic tea tax. But once again, they severely misjudged the colonial reaction. The Tea Act enraged multiple groups in America. First, it threatened the livelihood of local tea importers, including those engaged in smuggling. Second, it reignited the taxation without representation controversy. The 3 pence per pound tea tax remained in place. Most importantly, it was seen as a British government conspiracy to divide colonial resistance through economic temptation. If colonists accepted cheap tea, they would effectively be acknowledging Parliament's right to tax. When 7 East India Company ships crossed the Atlantic, loaded with 250 tons of tea, the Sons of Liberty and other patriot organizations began mobilizing opposition. They pressured tea dealers to reject the shipments. In Philadelphia and New York, mass demonstrations forced ships to turn back. But in Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson decided to take a hard line. He refused to let the tea ships leave, insisting that cargo must be unloaded and taxes paid. This decision would trigger one of the most famous protest actions in American history. On the evening of December 16, 1773, Boston's Old South Meeting House was packed with 7,000 angry colonists, nearly half the city's adult male population. They demanded the tea ships leave immediately, but the captain said they couldn't depart without the governor's permission. When Hutchinson finally refused to grant permission, Samuel Adams stood up and declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." This was a prearranged signal. About 50 Sons of Liberty members disguised as Mohawk Indians rushed from the meeting house toward Boston Harbor. They chose Indian disguises with deep symbolic meaning, expressing their new identity as Americans rather than Britons. Under the gaze of thousands of spectators, these Indians boarded the 3 tea ships. They systematically broke open 340 chests of tea and dumped the contents into the harbor. The entire process was conducted in an orderly fashion, with no other property damaged. Someone even replaced a ship's lock that was accidentally broken. A total of 92,000 pounds of tea, worth nearly $2 million in today's money, was destroyed in 3 hours. Patriots viewed the Boston Tea Party as a bold and noble act of resistance. John Adams wrote in his diary, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the Patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking." The symbolic significance of this action far exceeded its economic impact. By disguising themselves as Indians, participants expressed their break with British culture. Through organized, nonviolent destruction, they demonstrated a new form of resistance. Not mob chaos, but principled rebellion. News quickly spread to other colonies, inspiring similar actions. Tea was destroyed in Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia. All of colonial America was resisting British trade policies, but London's reaction was completely different. The British government and public reaction to the Boston Tea Party was shock and outrage. This was no longer protest or petition. This was a direct attack on private property, a blatant defiance of British authority. Prime Minister North and his cabinet believed that if this behavior wasn't severely punished, British rule in North America would completely collapse. Other colonies would follow Boston's example, and imperial authority would become a laughingstock. King George III was even more furious. In his view, this was treason and must be suppressed with an iron fist. "We must either master them or totally leave them to themselves," he told North. In spring 1774, Parliament passed a series of punitive laws designed to completely crush Massachusetts' rebellious spirit. These laws were called the Coercive Acts in Britain, but in the colonies they had a more powerful name, the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor would be blockaded until tea losses were compensated. Massachusetts' government would be reorganized, with British officials gaining greater power. Most provocatively, the Quartering Act required colonies to provide housing for British troops. The British government believed that by isolating and punishing Massachusetts, they could intimidate other colonies into submission. This was their final and most fatal miscalculation. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, the British government unified the previously divided colonies. The Intolerable Acts were seen as a threat to all colonial freedoms. If Britain could treat Massachusetts this way, would any other colony be safe? In September 1774, all colonies except Georgia sent delegates to the First Continental Congress. These representatives from different backgrounds, planters and merchants, lawyers and farmers, conservatives and radicals, united against what they perceived as British tyranny. Those Bostonians who disguised themselves as Indians to dump tea didn't know they had just crossed a point of no return. Britain's harsh response wouldn't bring compliance, but would ignite the flames of revolution. From the Victory Peak of 1763 to the united colonial resistance of 1774 took only 11 years. A series of seemingly reasonable policy decisions, imposing taxes to pay for defense costs, ensuring enforcement of trade regulations, punishing lawbreaking, accumulated into the greatest political disaster in imperial history. Most ironically, Britain didn't lose the American colonies due to excessive oppression, but because they tried to incorporate the colonies into normal imperial administration. 150 years of salutary neglect had fostered an independent spirit, and when Britain finally tried to exercise its theoretical authority, it was too late. The lesson of this story is profound. Power lies not just in having authority, but in knowing when and how to exercise it. The British government had legal power to rule the colonies, but they lacked the political wisdom to use that power effectively. In every crisis, they chose coercion over compromise, principle over pragmatism. When tea floated in Boston Harbor's waters, The course of world history had irreversibly changed. A new nation was about to be born, an old empire was about to split. And it all began with a seemingly simple question: who had the right to decide how much tax the colonies should pay?